Look, the Ukrainian people have been traumatized by 3 years of war. They have been subjected to what is fundamentally a genocidal campaign by a power and a government that seeks the eradication of the Ukrainian state and the incorporation of the Ukrainian people into the Russian people. And so I think that there is, if earlier on there might have been a sense that peaceful coexistence could be possible, I think it's much harder for people to see that now.
Now, let's talk about this. Speaking in the Oval Office this afternoon, Donald Trump told reporters that it may be easier to deal with Russia than with Ukraine when it comes to reaching a final settlement in the war. The comments followed the Kremlin saying that both Moscow and Washington see the Istanbul draft accords drawn up before February 2022 as a possible basis for a peace deal. That's something Ukraine's president has previously rejected as unacceptable. So what to make of these developments? Let's speak to Professor Samuel Greene, director of the Russian Institute at King's College London. Samuel, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Fantastic. Okay, first of all, let's talk about these accords, the Istanbul draft accords. Now, many people may not remember what they said and why the Russians might consider them as a reasonable basis for going forward. But let's remember, Zelensky said no, unacceptable. What would you read into this? I mean, what did those accords contain?
Well, I mean, two very basic things, and you have to remember when they came about. They were in very early, phases of the war, when Ukraine had not yet received the amount of support that it would eventually receive from the United States under the Biden administration and from Europe, when I think there was a greater sense of peril that in fact Kiev itself may fall. But the idea essentially was that Ukraine would agree, essentially a ceasefire. It would agree to forego NATO membership, and it would agree to seek the restoration of its territory lost initially in the original Russian invasion in 2014, not through military means, but through diplomatic means, which in truth was what Ukraine had already been doing. So essentially, it was a means to stop the fighting, to stop the carnage, and to avoid the deepening of the war. The Ukrainians, I think, very rapidly came to the conclusion that the Russians were not likely actually to hold to this agreement, whereas they and the West would very much be bound by it, and thus would be left unable to defend themselves.
And given that Russia has now, after 3 years of war, managed to seize 20% of their territory, and their biggest supporter, the US, now has tilted away and is saying they don't have any cards and that Putin is only doing what anyone else would, how far might the Ukrainian position towards these accords have changed?
Look, the Ukrainian people have been traumatized by 3 years of war. They have been subjected to what is fundamentally a genocidal campaign by a power and a government that seeks the eradication of the Ukrainian state and the incorporation of the Ukrainian people into the Russian people. And so I think that there is, if earlier on there might have been a sense that peaceful coexistence could be possible, I think it's much harder for people to see that now. But at the same time, Ukrainians are tired, they are uncertain, and they do not want to be the plaything in a relationship between Moscow and Washington. And so if they could get to an arrangement that would allow them to stop the fighting, but also to defend themselves against renewed Russian aggression, as President Zelensky mentioned in the Oval Office, last week, there had been a number of ceasefires over the years since the original invasion of 2014, and Putin has violated every single one of them. And so what Ukraine fundamentally needs is a guarantee that this will not be another violated ceasefire in that long list.
Mm-hmm. And what does this mean for the talks that will take place in Saudi Arabia next week between the Ukrainians? I think Zelensky is going to be in an ante-room. He's not going to take part directly. And US officials led by Marco Rubio.
Well, I mean, they're trying to come back to this idea of a natural resources agreement that would provide, in one way or another, for the way Trump sees it, at least, for the U.S. to be compensated for at least a portion of the support that it has given to Ukraine. The hope from the Ukrainian side is that this would essentially by the Trump administration into a long-term security prospect for Ukraine. This is also something I think that the Europeans see as critical. Europe, really ever since Trump was elected, but certainly with more urgency, first since the Munich Security Forum, and then since that blow up in the Oval Office the other week, has been looking for a way to secure Ukraine and really to Trump-proof Ukraine, but they are wary about trying to do that in the face of headwinds coming from Washington. And so it's very important, both from Keir Starmer's perspective and from Macron's perspective and from Friedrich Merz's perspective in Berlin, from the European Commission's perspective, that if at all possible, the U.S. be kept on sides. And this is the signal that the administration in Washington has given as to what would allow them to be on side.
Thank you. And Samuel, one of my listeners, Ben, says that we're making a mistake by choosing to frame the crucial start of the Ukraine conflict as being Putin's invasion. He goes on to say, this view is too narrowly framed. It ignores the history before the invasion that saw the growth of a USA and Ukrainian military buildup on Russia's border, and that buildup made Putin feel threatened. And he makes a comparison with the 1960s Cuban Missile Crisis, which provoked the US into that near annihilation with Russia. What do you think of those who would say, well, actually, it didn't start, this war, in 2022. Russia was provoked by what went on beforehand?
Well, there's some truth and there's some illusion in there. It did not start in 2022. If we're looking for a date, it started in 2014, when there were no real prospects of Ukrainian accession to NATO, when there were protests that eventually led to the downfall of the government of then President Viktor Yanukovych, who had been pursuing a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement and an association agreement with the European Union, who then abandoned that under significant pressure from Moscow and was forced out of office by the force of opinion of the Ukrainian people and by long-running protests in the streets of Kyiv and other cities. The Russian government intervened on the back of that. It seized Crimea. It intervened militarily in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, and occupied Ukrainian territory illegally and pursuing human rights violations really from that entirety of that period from 2014 until it renewed its invasion, made it a full-scale invasion in February of 2022. If we want, we can go further back into history. We can look at the Russian direct intervention in Ukrainian elections in 2004, 2005, in order the first time to attempt to install a Russia-friendly president in the person of Viktor Yanukovych, again, against the will of the Ukrainian people. We can also look at the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. Right? Russia has, for reasons that we could spend time talking about, but that are best known to Vladimir Putin, has decided that it needs to exercise political, economic, and indeed military dominion over its former empire in what used to be the Soviet Union. Ukraine is very much the linchpin of that, and we have seen consistently Russia's willingness to put the force of arms behind that domination.
Okay. Professor Samuel Greene, thank you very much for giving us your perspective. And Samuel is director of the Russian Institute at King's College.